Memphis, Tennessee. August 16th, 1977. A 21-year-old woman walks through the rooms of Graceland and finds the man she was supposed to marry dead on the bathroom floor. He was 42 years old. He had been the most famous entertainer on the planet. He had been married, divorced, and was engaged to be married again when it ended. What happened between the boy from Tupelo, who shook the world, and the final chapter that unfolded in that mansion, the love story, the betrayals, the years of quiet unraveling, is one of the most human stories in American music history. This is the tragic story of the Elvis Presley marriage. The boy before the king. To understand how Elvis Presley loved and how he lost, you have to start long before the fame, long before Graceland, long before any of it. Elvis Aaron Presley was born on January 8th, 1935, in Tupelo, Mississippi, in a two-room house his father Vernon had built by hand. The family had almost nothing. Vernon Presley worked odd jobs and struggled to keep the lights on, and there were stretches of genuine hardship. His mother, Gladys, was the anchor of the household, fiercely devoted to her son in the way that only a mother who had lost a twin child at birth could be. Elvis had a twin brother, Jesse Garon, who was stillborn. From the very beginning, Gladys poured everything into the boy who had survived. The bond between Elvis and his mother was unlike almost anything else in his life. She called him by nicknames, worried about him constantly, and treated him with a tenderness that never fully left him, even as he grew into a man and then into a phenomenon. People who knew them both described it as inseparable, the kind of closeness that goes bone deep. Gladys didn't just love her son. She was devoted to him in a way that shaped how he saw women, how he needed to be seen, for the rest of his life. The family moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1948, settling into a housing project called Lauderdale Courts. Elvis was 13. He was quiet, polite, and largely invisible in the social landscape of his school. He dressed differently from the other kids. Brighter colors, pleated pants, his hair styled with care. He sang at church, played guitar at home, and carried himself with a sensitivity that could easily be mistaken for shyness. What nobody fully recognized in those years was what was already forming inside him musically. He was absorbing everything: the gospel music from church, the rhythm and blues coming out of the black neighborhoods of Memphis, the country sounds that had always been in the air. He was quietly building something that would eventually knock the entire country sideways. In 1954, 18 years old and working as a truck driver, Elvis walked into Sun Records and recorded a couple of songs as a birthday present for his mother. Sam Phillips, the man running Sun Records, wasn't immediately struck by what he heard, but he kept the young man's name on file. A year later, Elvis was called back in, and what happened in that studio during the summer of 1954 would change American music permanently. By 1956, Elvis Presley was not just famous. He was a force of nature. The television appearances, the hip movements, the voice that could go from a whisper to a roar inside a single phrase, all of it combined into something that had never existed before. Girls screamed and fainted at his concerts. Parents and moral authorities denounced him as dangerous. Radio stations played his records around the clock. He signed with RCA Records, moved to a larger stage, and within the span of a single year went from driving a truck in Memphis to appearing on The Ed Sullivan Show in front of tens of millions of people. But for all of that, for all the screaming crowds and the television cameras and the national conversation he was suddenly dominating, there was something that Elvis carried privately that the public largely didn't see. In August 1958, right in the middle of his army induction, He had been drafted and was preparing to ship out to Germany. His mother, Gladys, died. She was 46 years old. Heart failure. The loss broke something in Elvis that was never fully repaired. He was 23 years old, and the person he had been closest to in the world was gone. He was photographed weeping openly at her funeral, something that was unusual for men of that era to do publicly. He had her buried at Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis. The grief was total and consuming, and the people around him said he was never quite the same afterward. He shipped out to Germany that same year, and it was there, still carrying that grief, that everything changed again. A 14-year-old girl in Germany. On September 13th, 1959, at a gathering at Elvis's rented home in Bad Nauheim, West Germany, a U.S. Air Force officer named Curry Grant introduced Elvis to the stepdaughter of another officer stationed at the base. Her name was Priscilla Beaulieu. She was 14 years old. Elvis was 24. She had come to the gathering in a navy and white sailor dress, nervous and not entirely sure what to expect. When she walked in, Elvis noticed her immediately. He had her sit beside him, played the piano, and sang for her, including a performance of Are You Lonesome Tonight? She was stunned. This was the most famous person in the world, and he was sitting in a room playing songs specifically for her. What struck him about Priscilla was something he articulated to a friend that night. He saw a resemblance to his late mother, Gladys. She had dark hair and a similar delicate quality that reminded him of the woman he had just lost. He told a close friend that Priscilla was young enough that he could shape her into exactly what he wanted. It was a statement that said as much about Elvis as a man as anything he ever put on record. When Priscilla left that night, she assumed it was a one-time thing. She was a teenager. He was a global superstar. Surely that was the end of it. But Elvis called and invited her back. On their second visit, he led her upstairs to his private room, where he spoke about his grief over his mother and kissed her before she left. She later described it as her first real kiss. The visits continued. By the time Priscilla had seen him 4 times, her stepfather, Captain Paul Beaulieu, demanded a meeting. Elvis came to the house in his army uniform, accompanied by his father Vernon, and spoke respectfully to Priscilla's parents about his intentions. He was careful, measured, reassuring. He agreed to terms: curfews, transportation arrangements, supervised visits. Her parents, somewhat stunned by the man standing in their living room, agreed to allow the relationship to continue. There was a pattern established in those months in Germany that would define the next decade of both their lives. Elvis called the shots. He decided when they met, what she wore, how she presented herself. He preferred her with heavy eye makeup and her hair styled in a particular way. She was 14 years old and utterly in love with the most famous man in the world, and she adapted herself to whatever he wanted. She has spoken, years later, about the way she tried constantly to appear older than she was, putting on clothes and makeup to close the age gap that existed between them. Elvis left Germany in March 1960 and returned to America. The relationship continued by telephone and letter across an ocean. For the next 3 years, they communicated regularly, with Elvis calling regularly and Priscilla visiting the United States when her parents allowed it. She was living 2 lives simultaneously: the ordinary life of a teenager on an Air Force base in Europe, and the extraordinary, entirely hidden life of a young woman in a relationship with Elvis Presley. In 1963, after considerable persuasion from both Priscilla and Elvis, her parents agreed to let her move to Memphis to finish high school. The arrangement Elvis presented was that she would live with his father Vernon and stepmother Dee, attend the local Catholic girls' school, and the two would work toward marriage. Her parents accepted the terms. What actually happened was that within a relatively short time, Priscilla had moved into Graceland itself, living under the same roof as Elvis, years before they were married. She enrolled at Immaculate Conception High School in Memphis and graduated in May 1963. The years that followed, from 1963 to the wedding in 1967, were years in which Priscilla was at Graceland, in Elvis's world, surrounded by his circle of friends and employees, while he continued his film career in Hollywood. She was there when he was home. When he left for Los Angeles, she was expected to remain in Memphis and wait. What she was not expected to know about, but did because it was almost impossible to avoid, was the other women. Hollywood and the women Elvis didn't talk about. The early 1960s were Elvis's film years. Between 1960 and 1969, he made 31 movies. Most of them were light, formulaic productions designed to generate soundtracks and keep his name in circulation during a period when the cultural conversation was moving rapidly away from the style of music he had made famous. The Beatles arrived in 1964 and shifted the entire landscape. But through it all, Elvis kept filming, kept recording, and kept living a life in Hollywood that operated on entirely different rules from the one Priscilla was living at Graceland. In 1963, while filming Viva Las Vegas, Elvis met his co-star, Anne Margaret. She was 22, Swedish-born, an actress and singer with enormous charisma and a quality on stage that mirrored something in Elvis himself. The chemistry between them on screen was unmistakable, and the chemistry off-screen was equally real. What began as a professional relationship became, by the accounts of people close to Elvis, the most genuinely mutual romantic connection he had during those years. Unlike many of the women who entered his orbit, Anne Margaret was not someone who simply adapted to him. She had her own career, her own ambition, her own presence in a room that didn't depend on his. Some people who knew Elvis during that period believed she may have been the one woman he had met who was truly his equal in the way that mattered most to him. Not deferential, not easily managed. The relationship between Elvis and Anne Margaret was serious enough that it generated public speculation. Reports reached Priscilla in Memphis. She confronted Elvis, and he dismissed the stories as press invention, insisting the coverage was driven by publicity needs for the film rather than any real involvement. Priscilla accepted this, or chose to accept it. The two things are not always the same. What ended Elvis's involvement with Anne Margaret was a practical collision between two worlds that couldn't coexist. Anne Margaret, in a press interview, gave the impression that she and Elvis were headed toward marriage. Elvis was incensed. In his world, Priscilla was the woman he intended to marry, and the suggestion that another woman might take that place, made publicly, without his control over the narrative, was something he couldn't tolerate. He confronted Anne Margaret directly, asking her whether she was going to be the kind of woman who could accept that things like this might happen, or not. The relationship ended in 1964. She would later write about it as one of the most significant connections of her life, charged, unfinished, and difficult to categorize. Anne Margaret attended his funeral in 1977 with her husband. Whatever had happened between them, she felt the loss. Throughout those years, there were other women too. Co-stars, women who appeared in his orbit during films, women who were drawn into his world by the gravitational pull of his fame. Elvis operated within a culture that had been built entirely around him. His circle of male friends and employees, known informally as the Memphis Mafia, existed to facilitate his life in every direction, including keeping these involvements from becoming public knowledge. The structure of his life was designed so that he could have multiple realities simultaneously, each one sealed off from the others. Priscilla, living at Graceland, was not entirely sealed off from what was happening. She read the gossip columns. She saw the photographs. She heard things. But she was also deeply in love with a man who, when he was present, could make the rest of the world feel irrelevant. And she was young, and she believed him when he reassured her. And she had invested years of her life into a relationship that had shaped her identity entirely. Leaving was not a thought she entertained. What Elvis told the people closest to him about Priscilla was revealing. He valued what he described as her purity. He had a compartmentalized view of women that placed them in categories, and Priscilla was the one he kept apart from everything else. Their relationship, according to Priscilla's own account in her 1985 memoir, did not become fully physical until their wedding night in 1967. He held her in a separate category from the women he was involved with during his film years, and that separation, in his mind, made what he was doing acceptable. By 1966, after nearly 7 years of a relationship that had taken Priscilla from a teenage girl on a German Air Force base to a young woman living inside the most famous private home in America, Elvis proposed. On Christmas Eve of 1966, he presented her with a 3.5-carat diamond engagement ring purchased from a Memphis jeweler named Harry Levitch. She was 21. He was 31. What came next would be one of the most watched weddings of the decade. The wedding and the life that followed. Elvis and Priscilla were married on May 1st, 1967, at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas. The ceremony was small. Only a handful of close family and friends were invited, and notably, most of the Memphis Mafia was excluded from the guest list. A decision that caused real hurt among men who had devoted years of their lives to Elvis. The brevity and intimacy of the ceremony was itself a kind of statement. Elvis controlled every detail, including who got to witness the beginning of his marriage. Priscilla wore a white organza gown with long lace sleeves and pearl detail, topped with a rhinestone tiara and a 3-foot tulle veil. She had gone shopping for it herself in disguise, wearing a blonde wig and using the code name Mrs. Hodge to avoid attention. Elvis wore a black tuxedo. Their first dance was to his own recording of Love Me Tender. The wedding cake was 6 tiers tall and reportedly cost over $3,000. Around 100 guests attended the reception that followed. It was, by all accounts, a genuinely happy day. They honeymooned briefly in Palm Springs, then returned to Memphis. 3 weeks at their private ranch near the Mississippi border. A second, larger reception was held at Graceland on May 29th for the people who hadn't been invited to Vegas. The early weeks of the marriage were described by those around them as a warm and private beginning, a settling into something that both of them had been building toward for nearly a decade. Within months, Priscilla discovered she was pregnant. Their daughter, Lisa Marie Presley, was born on February 1st, 1968, exactly 9 months after the wedding. The timing was precise enough to be noted by everyone who followed Elvis's life. Lisa Marie's birth was a genuine source of joy for Elvis. He was photographed holding her with an openness and warmth that was unmistakably real. He had grown up without siblings who survived, had lost his mother, and here was a child of his own, something new and entirely his. People who were at Graceland during those early months described him as a devoted and attentive father, someone who genuinely delighted in his daughter. But the marriage was already running into the tensions that would eventually break it. Elvis's career during the late 1960s was going through a significant transition. The run of largely forgettable films was winding down. In 1968, he returned to live performance with a televised concert special, later known as the '68 Comeback Special, that reminded the world exactly what he was capable of. He appeared in all black leather, leaner and more focused than he had been in years, and delivered performances that were electric. It was one of the most dramatic professional rebirths in entertainment history. With the renewed career momentum came the return to touring, to Las Vegas residencies, to the life that had existed before the marriage, the constant travel, the entourage, the long stretches of time away from Graceland. Priscilla was expected to remain at home with Lisa Marie. The pattern from the years before the wedding reasserted itself, but now with a child involved and a marriage certificate on the wall. The affairs continued. Elvis had not changed his fundamental behavior. The touring life brought women. Las Vegas brought women. The entourage maintained its function. Priscilla, now a married woman and a mother, was living a version of the same life she had lived as an unmarried woman at Graceland, waiting, managing the household, raising her daughter, and watching her husband's public life from a distance. Something had also shifted in how Elvis saw Priscilla after the birth of Lisa Marie. The compartmentalization that had always defined how he saw the women in his life now applied to his own wife. People who knew him well said that after Priscilla became a mother, he seemed to place her in a different category, a category he didn't know how to inhabit romantically. The intimacy in their marriage changed. Priscilla wrote about this in her memoir with considerable candor. For several years, she endured it. She raised their daughter, kept the household running, and maintained the public image of a settled, content marriage. But she was growing into a woman who wanted something that Graceland, for all its grandeur, wasn't providing. She wanted autonomy. She wanted a life that was genuinely her own, not just an extension of his. She began taking dance lessons in the early 1970s. Through those lessons, she developed feelings for her instructor, a man she referred to in her memoir only by the name Mark. It was her first real acknowledgement that she was capable of wanting something outside of what Elvis had given her. The relationship remained relatively brief, but it was a turning point internally for Priscilla, a signal to herself that the life she had built entirely inside his world was no longer enough. By early 1972, it was over. She and Elvis separated in February of that year. The separation, the divorce, and what remained. The separation was announced quietly and without the kind of dramatic public confrontation that tabloids might have hoped for. Elvis and Priscilla had spent 14 years together, more than a third of his entire life up to that point. And whatever damage had accumulated in those years, there was also genuine history and genuine affection beneath it. After separating from Elvis, Priscilla began a relationship with karate instructor Mike Stone, a man whose path had actually crossed Elvis's world, since Elvis was a dedicated student of karate and Stone had been his teacher. The irony was not lost on anyone close to the situation. Elvis was reportedly furious when he learned the details of Priscilla's involvement with Stone, furious in the particular way of a man who had spent years justifying his own behavior while expecting fidelity from his wife. The people around him said his reaction to losing Priscilla was more intense than anyone had anticipated. The divorce was finalized on October 9th, 1973, in Santa Monica, California. What the public saw that day was not what they had expected. Elvis and Priscilla walked out of the courthouse together, holding hands, smiling. They embraced in the parking lot. The photographers captured images of two people who appeared, in spite of everything, to still care deeply about each other. It was a genuine moment, the formal ending of a marriage between two people who had grown up together, in some sense, and who would remain linked by their daughter and by the weight of everything they had shared. The settlement was fair. Priscilla received $725,000 in cash, child and spousal support, 5% of Elvis's new publishing companies, and half the proceeds from the sale of their Beverly Hills home. She had initially been offered less, but after consulting new lawyers, she revised the terms to reflect what Elvis could actually afford. He didn't fight it. They remained on good terms after the divorce. They co-parented Lisa Marie. They called each other. They attended events together for their daughter. The relationship that had survived Germany and Hollywood and years of distance and infidelity had evolved into something quieter and more sustainable, a genuine friendship built on the foundation of everything they had been through. But Elvis, now in his late 30s, was entering the most difficult period of his life. The years after, Linda Thompson, and the long unraveling. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Elvis met Linda Thompson. It was the end of 1972. He had met her while the separation was underway, at a private movie screening at the Memphian Theater in Memphis, his preferred way of spending late nights. Thompson was 22 years old, recently crowned Miss Tennessee Universe, born and raised in Memphis. She was direct, funny, and entirely unintimidated by him. When Elvis began flirting with her that night, she pushed back. She had believed he was still married to Priscilla, and she was wary. When he told her the marriage was over, she famously challenged him, telling him he should have married a Southern girl in the first place. He laughed, agreed, and told her she was absolutely right. That moment, Thompson later wrote, was the beginning of everything between them. She moved into Graceland. For 4 years, from 1972 to 1976, Linda Thompson was the person closest to Elvis Presley in the world. She was his companion, his confidant, his constant presence. She has described their relationship as genuine and deep, built on shared humor, shared faith, shared Southern roots. They talked about getting married. For a time, it seemed like the life that hadn't quite worked with Priscilla might work with her. But Elvis, during those years, was also a man in serious decline, and Linda Thompson was increasingly the person managing that decline. His dependence on prescription medication had been building for years. Doctors, particularly a Memphis physician who had been providing him with prescriptions for an extended period, had enabled a level of drug use that was genuinely dangerous. Elvis was taking sleeping pills, stimulants, painkillers, and a range of other medications that were altering his behavior, his weight, and his physical health in visible and troubling ways. Thompson found herself in the role of caregiver more than girlfriend. She watched him, kept track of his medications, called his doctor when things became alarming, tried to intervene when his behavior was erratic. There were nights when she sat up monitoring his breathing. There were mornings when she wasn't certain what state he would be in when he woke. The people around Elvis, the doctors, the members of his inner circle, were not always willing or able to force a confrontation about what was happening to his health. And so the weight of managing it fell largely on the woman sleeping beside him. It was an enormous burden for a woman in her 20s to carry, and she has been honest in interviews about the toll it took on her. She loved him. She also couldn't sustain what the relationship was asking of her indefinitely. By 1976, after nearly 5 years at Graceland, Linda Thompson left. She has explained, in the years since, that she was emotionally exhausted and frightened for his safety in a way that she couldn't fix. She was not abandoning him. She was trying to save herself. But leaving meant that Elvis now needed someone else. He met Ginger Alden in late 1976. Her older sister was Miss Tennessee and had been invited to Graceland, and Elvis was immediately drawn to the younger sister, 20-year-old Ginger. She was beautiful, quiet, and in the initial phase of things, completely overwhelmed by the world she had entered. Elvis proposed to Ginger in January 1977. According to her account, He had his jeweler take the diamond from his famous TCB ring, the ring he wore that represented his personal motto, taking care of business, and reset it as an engagement ring for her. It was a significant gesture from a man who wore that ring as an emblem of his identity. They talked about a December wedding. Elvis told people he planned to give her the wedding of the century. But by the summer of 1977, Elvis Presley was in serious physical trouble. The touring schedule had continued, driven in part by financial pressures and in part by Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, who kept booking engagements regardless of Elvis's condition. People who attended his concerts in 1977 have described performances where he was barely able to get through the songs, slurring his speech, losing his place in the music, moving with difficulty. His weight had increased significantly from the athletic young man of his early career. His face was puffy. His eyes were glazed. Audiences sat in stunned silence watching someone they loved visibly struggling. His last concert was on June 26, 1977, at Market Square Arena in Indianapolis, Indiana. He managed to get through it. Nobody who was there that night fully understood it would be the last time. August 16th, 1977. The last weeks of Elvis Presley's life were spent largely at Graceland. He had a tour scheduled to begin on August 17th, a flight to Portland, Maine, to open a run of shows. There were people in his circle who quietly wished he would cancel it. His health had made the preceding months of touring difficult. Some nights on the road had been genuinely troubling for anyone who watched him perform. But the tour was booked, and the machinery around Elvis Presley kept moving. The night before, in the very early hours of August 16th, he returned to Graceland from a late-night visit to the dentist. He spent the early morning hours dealing with last-minute tour preparations, talking with members of his household, and eventually retired to his master suite sometime around 7 in the morning to rest before the evening flight. His 9-year-old daughter, Lisa Marie, was at Graceland that week. He had spent time with her in those final days, riding golf carts around the property, watching movies, being her father. Ginger Alden was asleep in the bedroom. At some point in the late morning, she woke and realized Elvis wasn't beside her. She looked for him and found him on the floor of his bathroom, unresponsive. He was face down on the carpet, having collapsed. She called for help immediately. An ambulance took him to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. The medical team worked to revive him. It was not possible. Elvis Aaron Presley was pronounced dead at 3:30 in the afternoon on August 16th, 1977. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death listed cardiac arrhythmia, an irregular heartbeat leading to heart failure. A subsequent medical review revealed that the extent of his prescription drug use had been a significant factor in his physical deterioration. He also had a number of other health complications that had gone unaddressed for years. The combination had simply become too much for his body. The news reached the world within hours. The reaction was unlike anything that had happened to American popular culture since the death of Franklin Roosevelt. A collective, simultaneous shock felt across generations and geographies. Fans gathered outside Graceland by the thousands. Priscilla was notified and came to Memphis. She has spoken about the moment she heard as something she couldn't make real in her mind. Lisa Marie, 9 years old, would grow up without her father. Elvis was buried initially at Forest Hill Cemetery in Memphis, the same cemetery where his mother Gladys had been buried. In October 1977, both his and his mother's remains were moved to the meditation garden at Graceland, where they rest today. The funeral drew 50,000 mourners to the streets outside Graceland. James Brown, who had known Elvis since 1966, was among those who came to pay their respects. He sat alone with Elvis for a long time. Caroline Kennedy sent flowers. President Jimmy Carter issued a statement calling Elvis a symbol of the vitality and the good humor and the creativity of American life. He was 42 years old, and he had been famous since he was 21. What was left behind? In the years following Elvis's death, the story of his marriage and his personal life became as examined and discussed as any aspect of his artistic legacy. Priscilla Presley threw herself into the task of preserving and building the Elvis legacy. She co-founded Elvis Presley Enterprises and was instrumental in the decision to open Graceland to the public as a museum in 1982. What had been a private home, the place where she had lived as a young woman, where she had raised her daughter, where she had built and lost her marriage, became one of the most visited historic sites in the United States, second only to the White House in terms of annual visitors by some accounts. She protected his name, managed his image, and fought to ensure that what he had created survived him. It was not a small thing, and it required her to spend decades in service to a legacy that was also, in ways that were complicated, her own. In 1985, she published her memoir, Elvis and Me, which became an immediate bestseller. It was the most detailed account that had ever been published about what their relationship had actually looked like from the inside. The Germany years, the Graceland years, the marriage, the affairs he denied, the way the relationship had shaped her entire sense of herself. She wrote about it with honesty and without apparent bitterness, which said something about the woman she had grown into. She never remarried. When asked why, she said simply that she never wanted to marry again after him. Linda Thompson built a successful life after Elvis. She went on to work as a songwriter and television personality, married twice, first to Olympic athlete Bruce Jenner, then to music producer David Foster, and raised 2 sons. She has continued to speak openly and warmly about her years with Elvis, describing him as someone she genuinely loved, while also being frank about the difficulties of those final years and what watching his decline had cost her emotionally. Ginger Alden, the youngest and last woman in Elvis's life, published her own memoir decades later, describing the romance from her perspective. The whirlwind of entering his world, the proposal, and the devastating morning she found him gone. She has said she was supposed to tell him not to fall asleep. Those were the last words she remembers speaking to him. Lisa Marie Presley spent her life under the extraordinary weight of being her father's daughter. She was devoted to his memory, fiercely protective of his legacy, and candid about the complexity of growing up without him. She died in January 2023, at the age of 54, following a cardiac arrest. She was buried at Graceland in the meditation garden beside her father. It was, in its way, the closing of a circle that had opened in 1968 when she was born 9 months to the day after her parents' wedding. In 2023, it was also agreed that Priscilla Presley would eventually be buried close to Elvis in that same garden, not directly beside him, but nearby. The woman he had shaped, who had shaped herself back out of what he had made of her, who had spent decades building the world around his memory, she would be close to him in the end. The full picture. The story of Elvis Presley's marriage is one that doesn't resolve neatly because the man at its center was never a neat person. He was capable of extraordinary warmth and genuine love. The people who knew him best, Priscilla, Linda Thompson, the members of his inner circle, have all described a man who could be tender and funny and deeply present when he chose to be. He was a devoted father to Lisa Marie in the time he had with her. He was generous to an almost reckless degree with money and gifts. He had a spiritual side that he took seriously, reading widely in religious texts and thinking genuinely about questions of meaning and mortality. He was also a man who had been handed total control of the world around him when he was very young, who had never been told no by anyone in his professional circle, and who had lost the most important person in his life, his mother, before he had fully formed as an adult. The pattern that followed, the need to control the women he loved, the compartmentalization, the inability to reconcile the different versions of himself. Those things didn't appear from nowhere. They were the product of a particular life, lived under particular pressures, without the anchors that might have given him different tools. He was never offered a genuine intervention. The people paid to serve him kept serving him, right up to the end. Priscilla Beaulieu was 14 years old when she sat down in a room in Bad Nauheim and heard the most famous man in the world play piano for her. She was 27 when she walked out of that life and began building her own. What she built turned out to be remarkable, not because of him, but because of her. And Elvis, who had everything the world could offer, who had sold over 1 billion records, who had made grown women weep simply by walking onto a stage, died alone on a bathroom floor in the house where he had been most himself at 42 years old, before a December wedding that never came. The mansion still stands on Elvis Presley Boulevard in Memphis. 100,000 people visit it every year. And in the garden behind the house, where the roses grow and the fountain runs, the family rests together. The mother he never recovered from losing, the daughter he loved with everything he had, and the man himself. The king. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.